December 1968. The long high mountains of Phu Thu Province. Captain Michael Harrington of the U.S. Army Special Forces stopped breathing when he saw the sentry. The North Vietnamese soldier sat against a tree, rifle across his lap, eyes open, head tilted at an impossible angle. No blood, no sound, no warning. Just death, delivered so quietly that the man beside him never woke. Harrington had 17 months of combat experience. 3 tours, Bronze Star. He thought he understood war. He understood nothing. 492 confirmed kills. 106 probable. Only 2 Australian Special Air Service soldiers were killed in action during 5 years of operations in Vietnam. The Pentagon said it was impossible. Soviet military analysts said the numbers were propaganda. North Vietnamese army commanders called them Ma Ring, jungle ghosts. Green Berets called them something else after joint patrols. They called them terrifying. You think elite special forces respect each other professionally. You're wrong. What Harrington witnessed in those mountains was not professional respect. It was primal fear wrapped in tactical admiration. How did 120 Australian SAS operators achieve kill ratios that made America's best look ordinary? Why did American Special Forces, men who jumped into Laos and Cambodia, who hunted in the A Shau Valley, refuse to patrol with them again? What philosophy of war transformed silence into the deadliest weapon in Southeast Asia? Stay until the end. Because what happened after Harrington filed his report changed how 2 armies thought about killing Dot. The helicopter dropped them 7 kilometers from any firebase. No artillery support, no quick reaction force, no safety net. Harrington carried 17 magazines, grenades, smoke, flares, radio, water, 48 pounds of gear designed to keep Americans alive in hostile jungle. The 5 Australians with him carried less, much less. Their patrol leader, a sergeant whose name Harrington never learned, wore a modified Stirling submachine gun with an integral suppressor. 34 rounds, no spare magazines visible. A knife, water, that was all Harrington could see. The weapon looked wrong, the barrel shortened, the stock cut down, black tape everywhere. American doctrine said you needed firepower. Overwhelming. Firepower. Call in gunships. Drop napalm. Unleash hell. These men looked like they were planning to whisper war into existence. They moved for 40 minutes before Harrington realized he had been making noise. Not much, just the slight scrape of fabric on bark, the rustle of a strap against a pack. The Americans taught movement discipline, but this was something else. The Australians flowed through the jungle like water, finding channels in rock. The pointmen stopped every 30 seconds, not to look, to listen, to feel. Harrington noticed. The man's eyes were half closed. He was navigating by sound and instinct, senses open to a frequency Americans never accessed. At one point, the patrol froze for 11 minutes. Harrington heard nothing. I saw nothing. The radio operator next to him barely breathed. When they finally moved again, the sergeant leaned close to Harrington's ear. VC patrol. 40 meters. North. 11 men. Harrington had heard nothing. Not a footstep. Not a voice. Nothing. They found the trail at 1400 hours. A narrow footpath worn smooth by countless enemy movements. Evidence of a supply route running between base camps. American doctrine was clear. Call in coordinates. Artillery strike. Establish blocking positions. Sweep with battalion strength. The Australian sergeant studied the trail for 20 seconds, then moved the patrol into observation positions 15 meters into the jungle wall. They settled into the earth. Harrington was positioned between 2 Australians, close enough to touch them, but unable to see them clearly in the vegetation. The man to his left became invisible. Harrington blinked. The Australian was still there, 3 feet away, but Harrington's eyes could not separate him from the jungle. It was not camouflage. It was something deeper. A stillness so complete it erased human presence. At 16:43 hours, the first enemy soldier appeared on the trail. North Vietnamese Army, judging by the uniform. Then another. Then 6 more. They were moving casually, weapons slung, talking quietly. Harrington's finger moved to his rifle selector switch. The Australians did not move. The NVA patrol passed within 10 meters of their position. Harrington could hear their conversation, see the details of their equipment. Easy shots. Clear. Kill zone. The Australians let them pass. Harrington did not understand. They were hunters who let the game walk away. The sergeant's hand touched Harrington's shoulder. A single finger raised. Wait. 40 minutes later, 3 more NVA soldiers came down the trail. These men moved differently. Alert. Weapons ready. A rear security element, Harrington realized. The patrol that passed earlier had been bait, consciously. Or not, drawing attention while these watchers followed behind. The Americans would have opened fire on the first group and been caught by the second. The Australian pointman rose from the earth like smoke, one moment invisible, the next behind. The last NVA soldier. Harrington never saw the actual movement. He saw before and after, with no transition between. The suppressed Stirling made a sound like fabric tearing, a soft cough. The first soldier folded. The pointman's hand moved to the second man's. Face. The knife appeared. Harrington looked away. The third NVA soldier started to turn. The patrol's scout, a man who had not moved for 2 hours, put 3 rounds into the enemy's chest from 12 meters. The suppressed weapon made less noise than a book dropping. The soldier crumpled without a sound. It was over in 4 seconds. 3 men dead on a jungle trail, killed so quietly that the patrol ahead, still moving through the jungle 200 meters away, heard nothing. The Australians dragged the bodies into the vegetation, took documents and maps, and erased evidence of the ambush in less than 3 minutes. They moved away from the trail at a different angle. Harrington's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. A realization that he was operating alongside men who practiced a different species of warfare. The Americans came to Vietnam with a doctrine forged in World War II and Korea. Firepower, air superiority, artillery dominance. If you made contact with the enemy, you called everything. Gunships, fast movers dropping napalm and high explosive. Batteries of 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters howitzers turning jungle into moonscape. The strategy was not subtle. Find the enemy. Fix the enemy in place. Destroy the enemy with overwhelming violence. Search and destroy missions were the operational expression of this philosophy. Companies and battalions sweeping through hostile territory, making noise, drawing fire, then crushing resistance with combined arms coordination. It worked against conventional forces. Against guerrillas who disappeared into the population and terrain, it burned resources and killed civilians. By 1968, the American kill ratio in Vietnam hovered around 3 to 1 in some areas, higher in others depending on the units involved. Green Berets and other special operations forces achieved better results through small unit tactics and indigenous partnerships. But even MAC VSOG recon teams, operating beyond the border in Laos and Cambodia, called fire support when compromised. The jungle was a problem to be solved with violence. The Australians arrived in Vietnam carrying a different history. They had spent 20 years fighting in the jungle, New Guinea and Borneo during World War II, Malaya during the emergency from 1948 to 1960. Borneo again during confrontation with Indonesia. The lessons were written in blood and silence. Jungles rewarded patience. They punished noise. Australian doctrine did not reject firepower. Artillery and air support had their place. But the SAS operating philosophy started from different assumptions. The jungle was not the enemy. The jungle was home. You learned its language. You moved through it like indigenous hunters. You became part of its texture. The Kanungra Jungle Training Center in Queensland turned this philosophy into a brutal education system. Every Australian soldier bound for Vietnam spent weeks in that tropical mountain country learning to navigate without trails, to move silently, to read signs invisible to untrained eyes. The SAS training went deeper, longer patrols, smaller teams. Aboriginal trackers from the Australian interior taught skills passed down across 40,000 years. How to see the story in a bent leaf. How to move without disturbing the pattern of the jungle floor. How to kill silently. The contrast was philosophical before it was tactical. Americans believed technology and firepower could substitute for patience. Australians believed the human weapon, properly trained, outperformed any technology in a close country. American patrols carried radios that reported constantly to headquarters, maintaining communication as a security blanket. Australian SAS. Patrols went 6 days without breaking radio silence. The Americans moved during the day, extracted at night. The Australians moved at night, observed during the day. American forces established fire bases and controlled territory through presence and patrolling. The Australians did not hold territory. They hunted. 5-man teams penetrate into enemy-controlled jungle for 7 to 14 days, living on minimal rations, carrying only essential ammunition, existing as part of the environment rather than an intrusion into it. Harrington watched the contrast play out across the remaining 4 days of the joint patrol. The second night they observed an NVA company preparing a base camp, 70 or 80 soldiers clearing jungle, establishing fighting positions, digging in for what looked like a long-term occupation. The American response would have been immediate and overwhelming. Map coordinates, fire mission. 6 batteries of artillery turned the area into hell. Close air support. Maybe a B-52 strike if the target was valuable enough. The Australians did. Something else. They watched. The sergeant spent 2 hours studying the enemy position, noting fighting positions, supply caches, and communication patterns. He sketched a detailed map. Then the patrol moved away silently, circling the position, marking approach routes and escape paths. They did not attack. They gathered intelligence. The strike, Harrington learned later, would come 3 weeks afterward, when other Australian units ambushed the NVA company on a trail junction 5 kilometers away. Perfect intelligence made for perfect ambushes. The 3rd day they found another sentry. This one was alert, positioned well, covering an approach to what must have been another enemy position. The Australian scout moved into position while the rest of the patrol provided silent overwatch. Harrington watched through the scope of his rifle, barely breathing. The scout took 11 minutes to close 30 meters. Movement too slow to register on human peripheral vision. When he was close enough, the kill was instantaneous. The sentry slumped against the tree, rifle still in his hands. The scout took the man's documents and ammunition and moved back to the patrol. No shots fired, no alarm raised. That night, camped in a carefully selected position on high ground, the sergeant spoke to Harrington in a whisper that barely carried 3 feet. We don't kill to make noise. We kill to make silence. The enemy fears what he cannot hear. The 4th day, Harrington understood why Green Berets were refusing to patrol with these men. It was not professional jealousy. It was not a cultural difference. It was psychological exposure to a methodology so alien it violated comfortable. Boundaries. American Special Forces were warriors. Elite warriors, exceptional by any measure, but warriors operating within a recognizable framework. The Australians were something else. Apex predators translated into human form. They did not patrol through the jungle. They inhabited it. Harrington realized he was watching men who had discarded modern military identity and reconstructed themselves according to older patterns: hunter-gatherer, tracker, silent killer. They used 20th century weapons, but the methodology was older than agriculture. Indigenous warfare refined through British Special Operations tradition and Australian frontier experience. It was primal. Watching them work made Harrington aware of every civilized instinct that made him human, and how those instincts became weaknesses in this environment. The patrol ended on the 6th day. Extraction was scheduled for 0600 hours. The Australians reached the landing zone 2 hours early, established security, and waited. The helicopter came in fast and low. 8 minutes from patrol to aircraft to altitude. Harrington climbed out at Nui Dat, the Australian base, covered in dirt and insect bites, 12 pounds lighter, permanently changed. The sergeant shook his hand before disappearing toward the SAS compound. You did well for a Yank. Stayed quiet. Stayed awake. That was all. No debriefing. No formal after-action review. The Australians moved like smoke through their own base, separate from the regular infantry units, apart from the command structure. Ghosts among ghosts. Harrington filed his report with his commanding officer 3 days later. The lieutenant. Colonel read it twice, then called him back into the office. Captain, I need to understand what you're saying here. You spent 6 days with 5 Australians. You observed enemy units on 4 occasions. You killed exactly 6 enemy soldiers, all with suppressed weapons. No fire support requested. Number. Extraction required until scheduled. No casualties. Kill ratio of 6-0, with perfect intelligence gathered on approximately 150 enemy personnel. Harrington confirmed every detail. The colonel leaned back in his chair. And your recommendation? Harrington chose his words carefully. Sir, I recommend we study their methods. I also recommend we do not attempt to replicate them without understanding the philosophical foundation. These men are operating according to principles completely different from our doctrine. Pairing Green Beret teams with SAS patrols for extended operations may be counterproductive. We slow them down. We think differently. They are hunting. We are fighting. Those are not the same thing. The report circulated through Special Forces Command. Similar reports were coming from other American units that had operated alongside Australian forces. U.S. Navy SEALs who trained with the SAS talked about fieldcraft that seemed superhuman. ACVSOG operators who observed Australian patrols noted the minimal equipment, the extended endurance, the refusal to break noise discipline, even when contact seemed unavoidable. The Pentagon flew observers to Australia in 1967 to study training methods at Canungra. What they found was not a technique that could be copied. It was a system that required fundamental restructuring of assumptions. The Americans could learn tactics. They could not, in the time available, reconstruct the cultural and experiential foundation that produced men capable of inhabiting the jungle as native hunters. Australian soldiers came from a country defined by hostile wilderness, the interior deserts, the tropical north, the island campaigns of World War II. They carried a cultural memory of frontier and jungle warfare that Americans, for all their pioneer history, had largely industrialized away. The broader truth was emerging by late 1968. The Australian Task Force, operating in Phuoc Tu province with approximately 7,000 men at peak strength, was achieving results disproportionate to its size. The SAS component numbered only 120 operators at any given time. Those 120 men were inflicting casualty ratios that military analysts initially dismissed as reporting errors. The numbers were not errors. They were the mathematical expression of a philosophical difference. Australian counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized constant patrolling, detailed intelligence, ambush tactics, and minimal footprint. They did not occupy territory. They denied it to the enemy through superior knowledge and patient violence. SAS patrols spent 70% of their time observing, 30% engaging. When they engaged, it was with complete information, advantage, and tactical surprise. The Stirling submachine gun with integral suppressor became the symbol of this approach. A weapon that whispered instead of screaming. A tool designed for surgical killing rather than suppressive fire. The weapon itself had history. The Stirling L34A1 was a British design, developed for special operations where noise discipline was paramount. Subsonic ammunition, suppressor built into the barrel assembly. The Australians modified them further, cutting stocks, removing unnecessary weight, wrapping them in tape to prevent reflection and noise. The result was a weapon that fit the philosophy. It could kill at close range without alerting anyone beyond the immediate area. Pointmen carried them. Scouts carried them. The men, who moved first and closest to the enemy, carried weapons designed for silence. Other patrol members carried the L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian version of the FN FAL, also modified. Barrels cut shorter. Flash suppressors removed. Everything taped. Some carried American M16s and CAR-15s, appreciating the lighter ammunition load. Some carried M60 machine guns for heavier engagements. But Stirling represented the core philosophy. Silent, patient, deadly at whisper range. The knife was another symbol. Australian SAS soldiers carried fighting knives that saw regular use, not for survival tasks, for killing. The silent sentry. Removal was a practiced skill, trained until it became reflexive. The technique was brutal and efficient. Approach from behind, using terrain and patience to mask movement. One hand controls the head or covers the mouth. The blade goes into specific anatomies designed to incapacitate instantly and silently. It was a skill from older wars, kept alive through special operations tradition. The Americans knew the techniques. Green Berets trained in silent killing. But the Australians practiced it as a primary skill rather than a last resort. They built tactics around it. Patrols specifically targeted sentries, cutting them silently to create psychological pressure on enemy units. The North Vietnamese began pulling sentries closer to main positions. Then they stopped using single sentries entirely. The fear was more effective than the kills. Harrington spent his remaining 6 months in Vietnam watching the war through a different lens. He saw American patrols moving through the jungle with equipment that clanked and radios that never stopped transmitting. He saw helicopter insertions that announced presence to anyone within 10 kilometers. He saw massive operations that achieved tactical success while teaching the enemy to avoid contact with superior forces. He understood why it worked that way. American forces were in Vietnam. To deny victory to North Vietnam, to support the government in Saigon, to demonstrate commitment to regional allies. That mission required visibility. It required firepower. It required operations that could be measured and reported. Australian forces had a narrower mission. Deny Phuoc Tu province to the enemy. Protect the population. Gather intelligence. Kill insurgents. The SAS mission was even narrower. Hunt. The difference in mission produced the difference in methodology. The philosophical contrast crystallized around a concept the Australians called negative tracking. American forces were trained to follow signs of enemy presence, footprints, disturbed vegetation, fighting positions. The Australians taught their soldiers to notice the absence of normal patterns. Birds that should be singing but are not. Vegetation. That looks too perfect. Trails that appear unused but show subtle signs of artificial restoration. It was hunting in reverse. Looking for what the enemy tried to hide rather than what he left behind. The skill required a different mental framework. Instead of thinking like a soldier tracking an enemy, you thought like the jungle itself, noticing disturbances in natural patterns. Aboriginal trackers from Australia's Northern Territory taught this skill. Men whose ancestors had tracked game and enemies across desert and bush for 40,000 years. They joined SAS patrols as specialists, bringing knowledge that could not be taught in Western military academies. The fusion of ancient tracking skill and modern special operations tactics created something unique. By early 1969, the North Vietnamese Army changed their tactical behavior in areas patrolled by Australian SAS. Intelligence intercepts revealed enemy commanders warning units about silent soldiers who killed sentries without sound. Bounties were reportedly placed on SAS personnel, though confirmation remained fragmentary. What was certain was the psychological impact. Enemy units in Phuoc 2 began moving in larger groups, posting multiple sentries, avoiding jungle camps, in favor of villages where civilian presence offered protection. The Australians adapted. They watched villages. They tracked larger units. They ambushed supply routes. The kill ratio remained obscenely lopsided. The Australian SAS would complete its Vietnam service in 1971 with casualty figures that defied military probability. 2 men killed in action. 3 more killed by friendly fire. 19 wounded. Against confirmed kills exceeding 490 and probable kills over 100. Individual patrols recorded 22-0, 30-0 engagements. One patrol achieved a 42-0 kill ratio during a 2-week operation. The numbers were not propaganda. They were documented in after-action reports, confirmed by body count procedures, verified by multiple sources. The American military studied the Australian methods extensively. After-action reports filled filing cabinets. Training observers watched. Australian operations. Some lessons transferred. Long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques improved. Small unit tactics incorporated elements of Australian fieldcraft. SEAL teams and Special Forces units adopted some aspects of noise discipline and observation methodology. But the core difference remained unbridgeable within the time frame of American involvement. The Australians were products of a system that started selection and training years before deployment. The SAS selected volunteers who had already completed infantry training and jungle warfare qualification. Selection itself was brutal, eliminating the vast majority of candidates. Those who passed then underwent months of additional training before joining operational squadrons. The pipeline from volunteer to operational SAS soldier took years. The Americans were feeding a war that consumed personnel faster than any training. Pipeline could match. 12-month tours meant constant rotation. Experience and expertise evaporated into the replacement system. There was another element, cultural. The Australian military was smaller, more intimate, built around a professional corps with selective conscription. The bonds between soldiers were tighter. The SAS was even more tightly knit, a community of specialists who lived, trained, and fought together over years rather than months. They developed collective instincts, unspoken communication, trust built through shared experience that went beyond military training. American forces, for all their professionalism, were constantly rebuilding those bonds. New arrivals replaced experienced men. Units formed, deployed, disbanded. The institutional knowledge that made the Australian SAS so effective was impossible to maintain in a force structure designed for scale rather than continuity. Harrington rotated home in July 1969. He carried memories he never fully processed. The image of the sentry, killed so silently. The feeling of watching men move through the jungle as if they belonged there more than the enemy. The realization that war could be prosecuted with such patience, such silence, such complete tactical discipline that it became something other than combat as he understood it. He stayed in the Army, made a major, taught at Fort Benning for a while, never spoke publicly about the patrol. Decades later, after retirement, he wrote a short memoir that circulated in military history circles. The key passage was simple. I trained with the best America produced. I served alongside brave men in terrible circumstances. But the Australian SAS were playing a different game entirely. They had reduced warfare to its most essential element. One man, one weapon, infinite patience, perfect knowledge of terrain. Everything else was supporting that core. We could not do what they did because we were not willing to abandon everything that made American military power American. We wanted to win with technology and firepower and speed. They were willing to win with silence and time and the willingness to become something other than modern soldiers. I respected them. I feared them. I never wanted to patrol with them again because watching them work forced me to confront how much of war is performance and how much is predation. The Stirling submachine gun with its integral suppressor became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of methodological divergence. When American forces looked at it, they saw a specialized tool for niche applications. When the Australians carried it, they were making a statement about the nature of their war. We do not announce ourselves. We do not rely on support we cannot carry. We do not make noise. The weapon was built around subsonic ammunition that could not reach beyond 200 meters effectively. That was acceptable because the Australians were fighting at ranges where they could see the enemy's eyes. They were not suppressing enemy positions from a distance. They were killing specific individuals. Stirling let them do that without alerting anyone else. It was a hunter's weapon, not a soldier's weapon. The distinction mattered. The broader lesson remained contested long after Vietnam ended. American military analysts acknowledged Australian tactical success while noting that Australian forces operated in a limited area with a narrow mission. The Australian methods worked in Phuoc too. Whether they would work in the Central Highlands or the Mekong Delta or against larger North Vietnamese formations remained theoretical. The counter-argument pointed to scalability. Australian techniques required fewer resources per patrol and achieved disproportionate results. If the American strategy was unsustainable politically and economically, and the Australian methods achieved better results per soldier, the question was whether America could have adapted Australian methodology at scale. The answer was probably not. The cultural, institutional, and political constraints on American forces in Vietnam required the war to be fought as it was fought, visible, measurable, prosecuted with American strengths in technology and firepower. To fight as the Australians fought would have required a different war, a different mission, a different timeline. The Australian SAS left Vietnam in 1971, part of the broader Australian withdrawal. The unit's reputation remained in the jungle. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong veterans interviewed decades later remembered the Australian forces differently from Americans. The Americans were powerful but predictable. They moved loudly, fought conventionally, could be avoided or engaged, according to tactical calculation. The Australians, particularly the SAS, were described as something else, ghosts, invisible until they were killed. Soldiers who understood the jungle, as well as the Vietnamese themselves. One captured NVA document, translated after the war, included tactical guidance for units operating in Phuoc 2 province. The section on Australian forces was specific. Avoid contact. Do not establish a pattern. Post multiple sentries. Never. Sleep in the same location twice. The document treated Australian patrols not as a military unit, but as an environmental hazard, like tigers or venomous snakes. Something to be avoided rather than engaged. The Stirling gathered dust in armories after Vietnam. The British retired the weapon system. The Australians moved to newer suppressed weapons. But for a specific period, in a specific place, it represented a philosophy of warfare that achieved results no amount of firepower could match. The same philosophy informed Australian special operations in later conflicts. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The institutional knowledge remained. Patience, silence, integration with terrain. Surgical violence delivered with complete information. Advantage. The methods evolved with technology. Night vision. Thermal optics. Satellite communications. But the core philosophy remained. Small teams. Minimal footprint. Maximum intelligence. Precise killing. The knife remained, too. Modern special. Operations forces carry blades designed with more sophistication than the fighting knives of Vietnam. But the skill set remains in training pipelines. Silent sentry removal. Close quarters killing without firearms. It is a skill from the oldest form of warfare, kept alive because sometimes the oldest methods remain the most effective. Technology has not replaced the need for a man to move silently to another man and kill him without alerting anyone else. That skill is still being trained, still practiced, still employed when missions require it. The Australians simply made it central rather than peripheral. Harrington's report circulated through military institutions for decades. It became a case study in doctrinal differences. War colleges used it to illustrate the tension between firepower-centric and maneuver-centric approaches to counterinsurgency. Special operations schools studied it for lessons in fieldcraft and small unit tactics. The core tension remained unresolved. American military power is built on technological superiority and overwhelming force. That model works against conventional enemies who present targets for precision strikes. It works less well against insurgencies that dissolve into populations and terrain. The Australian model demonstrated an alternative. Become better at the enemy's war than the enemy himself. Out-guerrilla the guerrilla. But that model requires time, patience, cultural adaptation, and a willingness to operate outside the comfort zone of Western military tradition. The American military has never fully resolved whether it wants to fight that way. The men who patrolled with Harrington returned to Australia as war wound down. Most stayed in the military. Some retired to civilian life. Few spoke about their service in detail. The Australian SAS maintains a culture of silence about operations. The stories that emerged came decades later, memoirs published by aging veterans, oral histories collected by military archives. The picture that emerged confirmed what Harrington witnessed. The SAS in Vietnam operated as a precision instrument. Every patrol was planned meticulously. Intelligence was gathered from multiple sources. Patrols moved through enemy territory with detailed knowledge of terrain and enemy patterns. When they killed, it was because they had positioned themselves perfectly. The romantic image of elite soldiers operating on instinct and courage was partly true. But beneath that was a foundation of intelligence, planning, training, and institutional knowledge that made seemingly superhuman performance replicable across multiple patrols and years of operations. The jungle itself became the final symbol. Americans fought in the jungle. The Australians lived in it. That distinction meant everything. American soldiers counted days until rotation home. They endured the environment. The Australians particularly the SAS, adapted to it. They learned to sleep in positions that would terrify most Western soldiers. They ate minimal rations. They moved through terrain Americans considered impassable. They became comfortable in an environment that was fundamentally uncomfortable. That psychological adjustment, the willingness to be miserable for extended periods while maintaining operational effectiveness, was a force multiplier that did not appear in any doctrine manual. It was cultural. It was individual. It was the product of selection that favored men who could endure and training that turned endurance into advantage. The years after Vietnam saw both militaries evolve. The Americans absorbed lessons about counterinsurgency, small unit operations, and the limits of firepower. Those lessons were forgotten, relearned in Iraq and Afghanistan, forgotten again, relearned again. The Australian SAS continued refining its methodology. Operations in East Timor, Afghanistan, and Iraq demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of the core philosophy: small teams, detailed intelligence, surgical violence. The kill ratios remained disproportionate. The effectiveness remained high. The culture of silence remained intact. In 2014, long after Harrington had retired and nearly half a century after the patrol, a military historian located him for an interview. The historian was researching Australian special operations in Vietnam. Harrington agreed to speak. He was 74 years old, still fit, still precise in his language. The interview took place in a conference room at a veterans facility. The historian asked about the patrol. Harrington described it in detail, memory still sharp on key moments. The historian asked the critical question: if you had to identify the single most important difference between American and Australian special operations in Vietnam, what would it be? Harrington thought for a long time. The Australians understood that the jungle was not the battlefield. The jungle was an ally if you knew how to speak its language. We treated it as an obstacle to be overcome with technology and firepower. They treated it as a partner. Every American patrol I was on, we were intruders. The jungle tolerated our presence. When I was with the Australians, they belonged there. The jungle accepted them. That sounds mystical. It is not. It is about observation, patience, and the willingness to adapt to the environment rather than forcing the environment to adapt to you. We could have learned that lesson. We chose not to, because learning it would have required us to stop being American in our approach to warfare. The Australians did not have that constraint. They were willing to become jungle fighters completely. We wanted to remain American soldiers who happened to be in the jungle. That difference determined everything. The interview ended. The historian thanked him. Harrington stood to leave, then turned back. One more thing. I never learned that. Sergeant's name. The patrol leader. I worked alongside him for 6 days, close enough to touch him most of the time, and I never learned his name. That was deliberate. They did not want us to know them. We were outsiders, observers. They let us watch because the command ordered it, but they never let us in. The silence was not just tactical. It was cultural. They were protecting something. A methodology. A philosophy. An identity built around being the best jungle fighters in the world. They did not want us copying them, because copying requires understanding, and understanding requires access they were not willing to grant. I respected that. I still do. The historian published the interview in a military journal. It circulated among special operations communities in multiple countries. The responses were telling. American Special Forces veterans acknowledged the accuracy and noted the continuing relevance. British SAS veterans commented on the shared heritage and different applications of similar philosophy. The Australian SAS said nothing publicly. The culture of silence held. Operational details remained classified. Methods remained protected. The tradition continued. Somewhere in Australia, men were training in the jungle and desert, learning the same skills, absorbing the same philosophy, preparing to deploy to future conflicts as silent professionals who would achieve disproportionate results and never explain precisely how they did it. Stirling is gone. The jungle camps of Phuoc Tu province are gone, reclaimed by vegetation and time. The men who patrolled there are aging or dead. But the lesson remains, carved into military history, studied in war colleges, debated in professional journals. War can be prosecuted with overwhelming violence or surgical precision, with noise or silence, with firepower or patience. The American method works. It defeats conventional armies. It projects power globally. It demonstrates resolve. The Australian method works differently. It achieves objectives with minimal resources. It wins through superior knowledge and perfect positioning. It demonstrates a different kind of resolve. Neither method is universally superior. Each fits specific contexts, missions, and constraints. What happened in those jungle mountains of Phuoc Tu province in December 1968 was a collision of methodologies. Captain Michael Harrington, a professional, soldier trained in one tradition, witnessed another tradition operating at its peak effectiveness. The experience changed him, not by teaching him different tactics, though he learned some, by revealing that warfare contains multitudes. The modern industrialized approach to combat is powerful, but not omnipotent. The ancient approach, refined through special operations tradition, remains viable. The tension between these approaches defines modern special operations. How much technology? How much individual skill? How much firepower? How much silence? Every special operations force navigates those questions differently. The Australians in Vietnam answered with silence. They built an approach around moving quietly, observing patiently, killing surgically. They achieved results that seemed impossible by conventional metrics. They terrified their enemies and unsettled their allies. They proved that a handful of men with the right training, the right mindset, and the right environment could outperform forces 10 times their size. The lesson was not that American methods were wrong. The lesson was that alternatives existed, alternatives that required different assumptions, different training, different cultural foundations. Alternatives that could not be easily copied because they grew from roots deeper than tactical technique. Harrington never patrolled with the Australian SAS again. He did not need to. 6 days was enough. Enough to understand. Enough respect. Enough to recognize that some soldiers are playing a different game entirely, by different rules, for different stakes. The Green Beret who refused to patrol with them again was not refusing from fear or inadequacy. He was refusing recognition. Recognition that he had witnessed mastery in a form he could admire but never achieve. Recognition that the gap between competence and mastery is not just skill but philosophy. Recognition that some warriors spend lifetimes perfecting approaches that cannot be taught in training cycles or absorbed through observation. The jungle keeps its secrets. The men who moved through it as silent hunters kept their secrets too. What remains is the record, the numbers, the kill ratios, the documented patrols, the captured enemy documents warn about ghost soldiers, the testimony of men like Harrington, who watched and understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not superhuman, not mystical, but something refined through selection, training, experience, and cultural inheritance into a form of warfare that operated at the edge of what human beings can achieve when they commit completely to a single methodology. The sentry at the tree, eyes open, head at an impossible angle. That image stayed with Harrington until his death. It was not the violence that haunted him. He had seen violence in abundance. It was the silence, the completeness of the kill, the utter absence of warning or alarm, Death delivered so precisely that the man 3 feet away never woke. That level of skill, that degree of tactical perfection, represented something Harrington's training never prepared him for. It was warfare stripped to its essence. One man killed another man without alerting anyone else. Everything that made modern militaries modern, technology, communications, fire support, logistics, command structure, was unnecessary. Just the hunter, just the prey, just the knife and the knowledge of anatomy and the patience to approach. Unseen Dot, the Australian SAS, proved in the jungles of Vietnam that ancient methods retain power. That technology does not replace fundamental skills. That small numbers of superbly trained men, operating with perfect information and complete discipline, can achieve effects beyond their apparent strength. They proved it with numbers that military analysts initially rejected as impossible. They proved it by making the enemy change tactics and behavior in response to psychological pressure. They proved it by surviving 5 years of operations in hostile territory with casualty rates that defied probability. They proved something else, too. That silence is a weapon. That patience is a force multiplier. That the willingness to endure discomfort and embrace an environment others fear provides advantage no technology can match. The story is not about Australian superiority or American inadequacy. It is about the existence of multiple valid approaches to warfare, each built on different foundations, each effective in different contexts. The American approach to Vietnam failed strategically while succeeding tactically in many engagements. The Australian approach succeeded tactically in a limited area with a constrained mission. Neither approach could have replaced the other. The Americans could not have won the Vietnam War by adopting Australian tactics. The scale was wrong. The mission was wrong. The political constraints were wrong. But the Australians demonstrated that alternatives existed, that patient hunter-killer methodology could achieve remarkable results, and that sometimes the quietest approach is the deadliest. Captain Michael Harrington watched men kill sentries. Silently, in December 1968, he filed a report. He rotated home. He lived a long life. The memory never faded. Neither did the lesson. War is not one thing. There are many things. The soldiers who prosecute it are not one type. There are many types. Some announce themselves with thunder. Some move like whispers. Both are valid. Both are necessary. Both are honorable. But they are not the same. The man who learns that difference, who witnesses it firsthand, who sees mastery in a form completely different from his own training, carries that knowledge forever, not as a judgment, as a recognition that somewhere, at the edge of what humans can achieve, there are men who hunt in silence, who kill without sound, who move through hostile territory as if they belong there more than the enemy himself. Those men exist. They train in the shadows. They operate beyond the headlines. They achieve results that seem impossible. And they keep their secrets, because secrets are the final weapon. The thing the enemy cannot study, cannot predict, cannot defend against. Silence.